we'll just start. I think like this one we maybe just flip through page by page,
Sure. Yeah, and I think
especially in the first issue.
Oh yeah, and I think before we were talking, we talked about or for recording, we talked about the logo on it. Tom Arozowski, he kind of took the Japanese logo and reworked it for the American edition, and it's one of my favorite logos.
He's a fantastic letterer, fantastic designer, and he had done all of the touch up and sound effects on the initial versions of it, and you rarely see a localization where they really devote the same level of craft to it as the initials do. It's really refreshing to read and actually be able to experience the sound effects and not just be sort of looking at them on the page and deciphering them after the fact.
Yeah, certainly. I think his wife, whose name I'll butcher, L. Lewis Buhalis, Buhalis. I think she did a lot of the lettering as well.
Oh, okay.
Okay, cool. All right, so page one. Immediately, I thought, okay, we have like an Akira sequel. So, it's like.
Oh, I should point out before you get to page in that one, I think there's like isn't there an introduction page before that with the planet Earth?
Yeah. Yeah.
So because the edition you've got is the English edition, Earth is backwards.
Oh, they didn't bother to leave that.
Yeah.
Like you could so easily flip the page, but just leave that cut out.
It's a weird thing because they do have such there's so much attention to detail in this, and that is such a weird thing to miss.
Was there that much attention to detail in the translation?
And certainly, yeah. Dana Lewis and Torrin Smith, I mean, they're just incredible adapters of things into the English language. I mean, I think there's a lot of attention to detail. I think that's one of those things that, like, once you start monkeying with the mechanics of the page, which they did in some later adaptations at the author's request, I think that you start introducing weird things. But yeah, that's the backwards Earth is.
Yeah, that would be an easy one to solve though, without monkeying with too much. Interesting. Huh. I didn't notice that. I kind of read that briefly and was like, oh, that's fun. But yeah, immediately like that Otomo influence, the buildings, the wreck city, like that's the first thing I thought. And then Brennan, this is what you're saying, where this first issue is you get thrown into a war zone. And that storytelling that I was probably turned off by as a younger person, like I couldn't keep up with it, I realized was giving some of that hectic sense of being in a war zone, because you're flip-flopping back and forth between the people, the soldiers outside, and then them on the inside, and then and he does that a bunch where the interactions like come together and split apart again through the storytelling. So this is the introduction to the characters just in their little zone, right, before the soldiers come in.
Yeah,
you have a better understanding of the story, so I'll let you explain that maybe.
Oh, I was going to say they're basically going through. They call it Bad Side, basically just the trashed America, and staying in these small towns that haven't been too destroyed, and so they found a little apartment that they're in, and I think there Briar Rose is saying that they use sarin gas or something. They used a type of thing, a biochemical weapon that killed everyone, but then left the food and everything fine after it dissipated.
And is that what they use the sarin gas for? Oh, the army has used the sarin gas on the.
Right.
Okay.
So everything's basically intact. It's like they've wiped out an entire city, but they can just stroll in and have an apartment and have a domestic situation right there. Although she doesn't seem like she's cut out for growing vegetables too long, I think is the message of the early chapter.
Oh yeah, they keep making a joke about how bad her cooking is that kind of goes away after the first book. Also, something that I really like about Shirow's work that I don't think exists anywhere else is Briar Rose has his name written on his forehead. Yeah. And later on when Hitomi shows up, she has a name tag and also her gloves say her name. And it's like this interesting visual thing to give you a character's name by constantly having them like labeled.
Well, and you like to label things in your work. Is that kind of one of the things where you got that from early on?
Very much so. He's also doing that cool technique on that page. So Shirow talked a lot about how he was much more into girls manga than the kind of boys action manga. And I think the techniques he's doing on that left page of like the pattern background, it's kind of like a wicker basket thing on the bottom right panel, to kind of show the emotion of the scene feels like a very kind of girls manga trick more than boys.
And Sean, we just talked about that. I tagged that elsewhere in the book because I think that's the pattern you were talking about.
It is, yep. That's
okay,
the one.
I wanted to ask you about it because you were talking about a pattern that meant to show confusion.
Yeah, or distress of some type, or turmoil, depending on how the pattern is snaked across the background. Yeah. And then on the right there, you've got the first appearance of you'll find this all over the action scenes towards the end of the book with basically how to show the interiority of the character who's encased in a big piece of metal. So they've got he's got a nice visual rendering trick of showing basically an overlay of the faceplate. And later on, you'll see sometimes we'll have the characters' faces behind the overlay.
I think that one actually, because I was confused by that initially, and this trip through, I noticed that I think it's actually Briar Rose's face, and it's him hearing the sound of the robot approaching.
Oh.
But he does do that technique that you're describing a lot. Like there's a thing I call the Shirow zoom, where he doesn't do it that much in this book, but he'll have a character in the foreground and background of the same panel, and it gives the effect that you're like getting very close to them very quickly because there's no panel border dividing it.
Right. Yeah, it's the equivalent of the Kurosawa shooting a long shot with a telephoto lens. So you have the compression of the extreme foreground and what otherwise would be extreme foreground or extreme background.
Yeah, very much so. It's a good analogy.
But Brandon's right. Yeah, this is Briar Rose's head hearing it, and then you zoom through his head. So this is, you really have to. He asks a lot of the viewer, which is, as I'm older, is cool. As a young kid, I was just like, I don't know what's going on. But yeah, he's zooming through to what he hears, and then you turn the page, and this is what he heard.
Right.
Is the guy walking down the street. Now, I tagged this one as an amazing example of just his compositions in terms of, I noticed this early on, there's a lot of just like really good directionality, like this walks to this, looks over here, gun goes down, and then she looks down to there, and then you catch this diagonal along there. So he's really good at like that Z or S pattern through the pages.
Certainly.
In almost all the pages I noticed that, but like early on, we're just a couple pages in, that just stood out to me in a way that most things don't stand out.
Yeah, and that layout is such a specific manga thing too, where you have a giant character kind of just pasted over all the other panels. It's such a difficult thing to pull off because I think oftentimes in American comics you want to assume that there's just a giant character now. It's like when you do doubling up of characters in panels and still manage to maintain their kind of autonomy from the backgrounds is really impressive.
Yeah, and then this is where I think it breaks the storytelling conventions that I'm used to, because you're flipping back and forth between this character outside, these characters inside, this character tripping and making a noise, but this one hearing it on the inside. And so you don't get that standard thing that people will tell you to do of like making sure that like you have an establishing shot that shows you the relationship between the characters. He doesn't give you that. But in a war scene, that would be how it is. You don't know where they're at. You're listening to them. You're kind of meeting. And Brandon, you had tagged a page, I think, or you sent me a page of formalisms you like, and you had one in there where that's going on in the apartment too, and the characters come together.
Something else worth noticing, I think, is that I am looking at the Japanese version of that same page, and the sound effects I think are just worse in the Japanese one. I think this might be the only example I can think of where the English translation, because that thing where the robots falling against, or the robot suits falling against the wall there, in the Japanese version, I don't know if it'll actually show up if I put it up there, but it's basically just a very thin-lined, thin-lined black kind of effect, and it is so much more. It feels so much more visceral the way that Orozowski does it there.
If you scan that and send it over, I'll plunk it in the video. I have a
Okay.
feeling this one will edit in more than I normally do. And then here you get the characters finally coming together. So it's almost the opposite of the establishing shot. You take, 2.5 pages to get to the establishing shot of the characters together. And then you flip over to like she's coming in on them from the front and Briar Rose is coming in from the side. So that placement of all the characters is continually disrupted throughout this first scene. And then like Briar Rose disappears again until like all of a sudden this shot really is the first time you really see all three of them together there. So at first I thought, what is he doing? He's breaking all the rules, I know, but it did, I don't know, eventually that sophisticated, like asking a lot of the reader for an emotional effect. I think that totally makes sense, especially in this first little bit here. And then we get the character. So Brandon, can you explain the Hitomi?
Oh yeah, so Hitomi is basically she's like an artificial person. They call them bioroids, which is kind of grown in a lab and has to take like life extensions every once in a while. And that's most of the people of the city that they spend their time in, like 80% of the population. But her job is to go into bad side and try to find specific people who were, I think, part of the DNA of the bioroids and bring them back to the city.
Okay.
So I'm probably getting too into it, but Dionan's father, Carl Newt, is one of the kind of people whose DNA was used in a lot of the creation of the city.
Okay, see, I didn't, that must come up later, because as far as I know, they were just going and recruiting police officers.
I think they start getting into it in volume 2, where Braeros identifies someone by their face and is confused when he doesn't respond correctly and everything.
Right. Yeah, Appleseed. It's hard not to go into a long
Right.
diatribe about everything. But yeah, basically she's like their inroad into this thing, and she's going to find them. And I don't think you can tell on that page, but she has a little name tag that says Hitomi.
Yeah, and this is the one that we're gonna each ink our own version based off the pencils you've got there.
Oh, and a technique I think that I tagged that one on for is the little puffs of smoke that he does a lot, which is something that I've definitely picked up, where I guess it's just kind of heavy breathing from her, but it's this thing that he does to almost show emotion. He uses like action lines in scenes that aren't where there's not movement, just is like emotion lines almost, and he uses puffs of smoke as almost like this like beating heart
exertion.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. See, and when I was first reading this, I thought this was someone that was escaping because she was clumsy and like tripped. This didn't seem like a professional coming into the city to recruit. She seemed like someone clumsy because she tripped, she gets caught easily.
Yeah.
And then it flips over so it's another kind of like red herring that he throws at you, as it seems like, oh, we're going to get in this battle and then it's easily resolved. And then he flips over to these guys in the tank, which is the actual some kind of crew that they're going to get into a battle with.
Yeah.
Let me just say Ga-chunk. Grin. I mean, just fantastic. Oh man. Yeah, I long for the days of a lettering like that. I mean, that's just.
I was going to say there's a weird thing with Appleseed where Deanna and Briar Rose are just disturbingly more competent than everyone else they encounter until one of the later books. I think they start running into people that are like much more competent than them, but it's kind of like a through line on that. Like you talked about Hitomi, them kind of shutting her down. Yeah, it's just very much just like they're so good at their jobs and they work together so well that everything else is it's a weird, I guess, but that's kind of what I think Shirow, a lot of his work seemed very kind of like American right wing to me at a certain point, right. But I think it's just that he loves military competency is one of his favorite things in the world.
Yeah, okay. There's definite. It's another example of taking what is sort of a trope of like a young men comic, Japanese comic, but then taking it and giving it plausibility in the context of the narrative, where you have, like you said, the bioroids being engineered to be not perfect, but even, you know, the council in the later books arguing about, you know, the evenness of humanity and predictability of humanity, the unpredictability of these other people, these other rogue agents. They're the rogues, like Dionin and Brearos are the roguish competence, right? There's this sort of justification for the pre-existing trope, the use of the
Right.
pre-existing trope.
Yeah, very much so. Oh, something on the tank thing, not to pick apart every panel, but on the tank thing, the comic Gray was coming out at the same time, and Gray is done in this really kind of unfinished style almost.
Oh yeah.
And there's something about this page that feels like it's almost out of that book. It's interesting. So it's a tank that is flying until it reaches the city, I think, and then they put down the wheels there. But he kind of goes out of his way to avoid showing it until it has its wheels down, and it's almost like how we expect a tank to look.
Well, there's something going on with the wheels here. It looks
Yeah.
like the wheels are coming up or going down.
Yeah, I think that's when they're going down. But the panel before that, it's just like the tank is, you just see a light.
Okay.
So it's a weird
this right
way to show
here.
it. Yeah.
And then, then the wheels are down here.
And it's wild how much time he would spend, I mean, designing something that's only going to show up for a limited period of time. I mean, he clearly is I don't think it's a stretch to say he's probably a detail-oriented person.
Yeah, it's hard to not read all these and be like, I'm always arguing with some friends of mine about like who qualifies as a genius in comics, because I feel like everyone's just a dork with a pencil, but I'd say that Shirow is the closest thing that I would call a genius, because he does things that do not make sense for normal people to do. It's so much effort and weirdness in his work, and something else, he doesn't have a standard panel layout where other people do, you know, like his pages change so much.
And just like as a single image, I mean, look at the Kashum right there. I mean, that's like that's a pinup in anybody else's comic, and you know, it's 1/6 the page there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, teeny tiny.
Yeah, I mean, just absolutely fantastic single panel composition there, and that same with that suspension image there, where they're leaping across the buildings right before that, and and the odd off kilter. You know, like your head just whipped up to see those buildings. You know, obviously he can draw in perspective with his eyes closed, and yet he's made those slightly off there, almost like you've just whipped your head up to it, and the curve of the line going up, and it's just a extraordinary drawing.
Or almost a Nausicaa mask that she's wearing there.
This one, yeah.
So we're 19 pages into his professional debut.
And now we're getting the battle scene. So like this is the first time they kind of see the tank, and then you keep zooming in onto the guys in the tank, which again I'm finding like he seems to be purposely disconnecting these characters from the other characters, like because they wouldn't be interacting in reality, and very small, like, oh, here's the characters up here that the guns are pointing at, and then you kind of, there's just a lot of jumping back and forth between things.
And that tank barrel is basically a 6-shooter, which is very interesting. It looks like a revolver.
Jack, shut the dogs up. Sorry, I got dogs growling in the back.
It's not that loud.
Okay.
They're upset about the how he does not show clear the clear characters and other characters in relation to each other.
Yeah, they are. This is not working. And a lot of headshots too. It's an interesting thing in the middle of a battle, focusing on kind of their emotional aspects. And maybe that goes back to being the interest in the girls comics that you're talking about, the interest in the emotional states and stuff.
Yeah, he does an interesting thing on that page too, where he has these constant, like, it seems like he does a ton of research on things. So they have to pause for a second there. And I guess this argues against my competency thing, where they're jumping around so much with Briar Rose's kind of cybernetic legs that it pools Dionan's blood and she like blacks out.
Right.
Oh.
He apologizes to her and says he had to move too fast in order to get away from that last shot.
Yeah, she's passed out there.
He seems hyper aware of the, like, not just legitimizing the thing he's already thought of, but like trying to get an explanation for what would actually happen where'd this thing happen? Gives it a kind of plausibility, more like a hard science fiction.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, and then there's more about, and then we go back to Hitomi here. So it's another one of those harsh cuts where she's escaping and then back to battle outside. Another thing I found interesting is a lot of artists, I think, would, and he does it in sections. It's like this page and this page are for the tank guys, and this page is for these two characters. So I think a lot of artists would spend a whole page showing her dealing with the handcuffs, and then they would save this big explosion for the next page, right? Like, okay, now we're back to that scene, and he'll cut them all into one page, which I found gave it that more hectic back and forth.
Well, it also gives it a more, I mean, that was one of the things I was going to say, is that the animation influence seems stronger to me than a comics influence in some ways. And intercutting like that being one example, although he preserves directionality in a very strong comic-y kind of way, but, you know, so obviously incredible illustrator. So this is one of the pages that I flagged right here, that the deformation of the Jeep there in relationship to the explosion, the way that he takes a realistic object and applies like animation precepts like squash and stretch to him as just extraordinary to me. I think that particular panel was swiped by at least one image founder who I won't name by name, but I think this is a swipe from at least one early Image comic, if I'm recalling correctly. But you can see why somebody swiped it, because I mean, who can draw something that looks simultaneously realistic but also like it's responding to the physics of something in like a plausible animation? I mean, it's just remarkable.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing for me at the time, because I've grown to really like a lot of the early Image stuff, but at the time it was in my mind, it was like a battle between this stuff that I was reading and the mainstream superhero stuff that was coming out. And I didn't quite see the connection, but like I worked for Rob Liefeld for years when I was doing the Prophet book. And it never occurred to me what a giant influence Shirow had on him.
Oh yeah.
And Jim Lee and all those guys.
Yeah, when we were looking at the Jim Lee, Sean, you were like, "Oh, those robots are straight out of Appleseed."
Right. Not necessarily the robot itself, is like the accoutrement, like all the little mechanical portions of it. But yeah, I forgot.
You were talking about Jim, all those Image guys. You talked about, I said blades, and you said, oh, they construct their images out of speed lines. They shade with speed lines. And the more I've been thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, that's totally what they're doing, is they figured out how to crosshatch the value on a figure with speed lines. And you know, this page is a perfect page to flip to, because like, yeah, of course they were looking at that.
I was going to say the missing connection between Masamune Shirow's and the Image founders is probably Arthur Adams.
Very much so.
And you know, all the Eclipse issues of Appleseed, they didn't have enough paintings to use to make all the individual images. So other than the first one, all of those were done by Art Adams.
Oh yeah, and I think Adam Warren came in and did a set as well. Yeah, really, really fantastic stuff. Yeah, I was looking at that Jim Lee book that you guys were talking about, and his early stuff was so it almost felt like at the time when he came out, it felt very fresh and new. But when I look at it now, it's almost like he was like this his style was almost this composition of all these amazing other styles, where he had so much like John Byrne and Art Adams and Shirow in it.
Yeah, he was like, okay, I'm taking everything that's working right now and then going to be the meta version of that, for sure. So it's interesting, as we're going through other stuff around that time, I'm going, oh, there's that thing. Oh, Barry Windsor Smith. Yeah, there's that thing.
Oh yeah, very much Barry Windsor Smith.
Sean, I had tagged this one, the Jeep on this one, another one of those physics things where the Jeep runs out and it literally hits the panel border, and you can see it like it creates this visual like tunk, you know, you can hear it tunk against the panel, and like it's hitting that building, and it really gave me this sense of it's gonna careen. I thought that was so smart. It usually, when people acknowledge the panel border, it's very fourth wall breaking, wink wink, you know, I'm gonna have the character break out of it or snap it or something, but that one just gave a more visceral response, and I thought that was a really fascinating little formalism there.
Yeah, what's the sound effect on that one? Is it just screech?
Scree and
It's scree, vroom, vroom. It would have been almost too much if they would have wrote like tunk, like against, against the panel border. So I like that he didn't do that.
Yeah, I feel like he would almost. I feel like it's almost like I wonder if he was purposely trying to make it look like hitting panel border, or it's more just he was doing like a hard cutoff of where it's ending. I was reading a Shirow interview where he talked about when he was doing this kind of stuff, he was obsessed with the American TV show Hill Street Blues. I should go back and actually watch, because there's a later Appleseed book where he got really into this movie called He Who Dares Wins, I think. It's a British SAS movie, and when you watch it, it's really weird because he would actually draw some of the furniture from scenes in the backgrounds of Appleseed. Like he was clearly like pausing through a VHS of it or something.
It's a bizarre approach. Let me sneak in this background from a movie. Yeah, I don't know. It works though. It works very well. She breaks out of her handcuffs and goes running.
Also, her gun on that page is incredibly early image.
Oh yeah,
the top right, the left.
People are taking notes.
Yeah.
Not enough pouches though.
Yeah.
If we can find the pouch precedent.
There's pouches. I think we'll hit pouches.
No, we will. Yeah. No,
he's got a pretty sweet belt right here.
This page is one of the ones that I had flagged. The directionality of this is just fantastic. He's coming in from the outside of the comic straight down onto Briareos. I'm going to say his name wrong every single time. I apologize.
I'm sure we're all mispronouncing everything on this.
Yeah.
And then we've got to push in. We've got to push in on his face, and then a flip, like 180 degree flip to a POV shot from Briareos from B, and then we're back to B's, or we're back to the omniscient view over the shoulder immediately afterwards. I mean, I just that whole page right there, the directionality of it is just fantastic, and it's funny because you don't realize you flipped. The POV is so quick and stealthy that I don't think you realize that you flipped that. You violated a cinematographer rule there.
Yeah, I always argue against that rule for comics because I think in cinema it's always like the worry is that it'll look like an I Dream of Jeannie thing where someone will flash and be in the wrong place. But with comics, you're moving your eye, so it doesn't quite work as well. But also the bottom left page there, where they're literally running down the side of a building together, is really fascinating.
Yeah, like all of this is going on, and it seems like it's on the top of a roof, and then they're going down the building, and it's like, when the hell did that happen? And then this character's just back in the picture again after having been disappeared for a page or two. And then Hitomi shows up in the tank kind of after being gone and throws a grenade, and then she's gone again. So there was just a lot of that. It's just more examples of that chaotic battlefield.
And then the guy Briareos is fighting gets hit with just a brick and ends that very conveniently.
Yeah, there's out of nowhere from the explosion, right? And then and then she shows up. Ta-da!
I love the squash and stretch, tiny head or tiny character, large head. I know that there's a Japanese word for that I'm not recalling at the moment, but he uses those particularly effectively, I think.
Oh yeah, I think they call it chibi now, but back then it was super deformed.
Right, SD, right.
Yeah, the chibi stuff is what I always hear it called. And then all of that madness slows down, and you get what you would expect. So then, by the time I get back to these scenes, I'm like, okay, all of that weird storytelling stuff over here, super intentional.
And under your hand there is a full. I was going to say under your hand is a full like Condorito plop from Briareos' feet.
Underwear.
Just under your fingers there.
Here.
It's just the edge of his foot just off panel.
Right.
Which is like, why is that going on? He's standing up here.
Emotionally, he's there.
Right.
Yeah. He's just exhausted. What did I write here? I make notes for myself. Okay. No, that was just about the whole sequence. Yeah, and then here you get the little chibi stuff. I like that. So that's issue 1. And then it took me, I actually had to go back and reread it after I read issue 2. because I was like, wait a second, who are all these people? I was so wrapped up in following the action, I didn't pick up on anyone's name really, even though they gave them. Or I don't know, do they name this character? Issue? I don't think they do.
Yunin doesn't get a name in the first one.
I wonder. Yeah, I don't remember if, because yeah, everyone has name tags except for her. Yeah, her name is Yunin Newt, and in a lot of the Japanese versions, he would write Nut on her name tag, and I think that was one of those things that the translators would always kind of have to explain.
You get an idea from this transition from the first section to the second section why an editor might have suggested maybe we should serialize this, because you know, the venue changes and you know, style changes and sort of intensity changes might not have flown very well in a serialization as opposed to somebody being able to buy 180 pages of it in a single chunk.
And that's how they're originally released there as well.
They were released directly to book, all except the fifth one that wasn't finished. Yeah, which is very unusual in Japan.
So I tagged this one here, just another little visual continuity trick that I noticed. It's something, Brandon, I talked to you about it a little bit because you made a joke in one of those image things about tangents and how you think they can be used well. This is, I found it interesting where there's this pile of like barrier bags here, and they're definitely not in the same scene, but the barrier bags look like they're in the same scene. And so it created like that, again, that flow down through the page. I thought that was a really interesting, subtle little trick. And then I just had to laugh that the sound effect here is fat.
Oh yeah, that was pre fat being a joke too.
Yeah, I wrote down fat, pre no fat. That was like my note.
Yeah, so that is a really cool trick because it almost, her being on the left side of that panel, it almost implies that she's turning the corner and it's the same sandbags.
Right. Yeah, so it creates a sense of shared scene, but allows you to change the camera angle and everything. Yeah, I found that to be a really fascinating little trick.
And yet they're still in opposition to each other. And you notice that she's always traveling left to right through this sequence here. And, you know, like she looks pensively, she might turn her head the opposite direction, but he's got a really strong sense of directionality. Maybe a video game influence. It's funny how little directionality seems to matter to people who are in film or, you know, things like that. To me, it's always like, oh, you know, you're traveling the right direction you read. But I guess people aren't necessarily reading or thinking about reading when they're watching like a, you know.
Yeah, I wonder what video games would even be, because it's 1985, I think is when this came out.
Right. Well, even the side scroller like Super Mario Brothers or something, which would have been the biggest, you know, game of the year before that or whatever.
Oh, certainly.
Has such a strong left to right directionality to it.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I'm always thinking of Pong or something from that era. That's even earlier. Yeah, he's so good at showing scale too.
Yeah,
like this piece here,
and designing for scale. He doesn't make the mistake of showing. You know, you always see the Olympus structures unless you're, you know, feel like you're going to get sick to your stomach. You're always seeing them from low, so you get that immensity to it. Do you think that that's based on a actual building, Brandon? It's such a sophisticated design. It really makes me wonder what.
I feel like because it reminds me a little bit of the O'Neill colony drawings you'd see from NASA. You know, it's the O'Neill colonies are just basically the tube that they would build a world inside of to have a colony in space, and it's not quite that design, but it has this, I don't know, because I feel like he gives kind of nods sometimes to the things he's referencing, but it's mostly political books.
When was the Cindy Opera House constructed?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that does kind of.
That's what I thought of. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that would exist before this, is my guess.
But the other thing I was thinking, looking at this is pre where we can have like a computer model of this that we manipulate and then trace off. And it can't be using that standard manga trick we see now where you photograph it and adjust it in Photoshop and touch it up. Like,
no, he's not using AutoCAD or something. He's working out.
Although I'd argue that doesn't really help anyone in the long run. It's like, I feel like it always looks a little.
Yeah. Well, he plays with perspective in such a, I mean, crazy way. I mean, I don't know how you would automate all that. He's obviously interested in it for
Yeah.
itself, it seems to me.
And he also does the very Shiro trick of having to explain that the buildings, those giant Olympus towers, are made out of a new kind of material. So that's how they can structurally hold themselves. It's like no one else would. It's like no, but there's a thing in the later Appleseed where, or it's in a later Ghost in the Shell where he has these airplanes flying in the sky, and he just makes a note on the side. He's just like, this isn't actually how the real formation is, but it works with the composition. And it's almost like you're reading it being like, calm down, dude. We all know we're reading a comic book.
But good on him for carrying that much.
Yeah.
I love that pull-out shot where you get the different environments too, and you get to see it not just in and itself and its glory or whatever. You get to see the people who are actually, living in the shadow.
All the cool cyberpunk punk rockers there.
One of them needs a keytar, I think.
They all need keytars.
No music in Appleseed.
What a utopian society.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just so impressed though by, he must have had a map of this because he's drawing these incredibly complex buildings, but from totally different. That boggles my mind.
Well, something about Shirow that really helped me not hate drawing is that he's pretty inconsistent from panel to panel often. Like he'll draw a robot and then it'll look fairly different next time he draws it. There's a hat in Ghost in the Shell where it is not even at all the same shape from panel to panel, and that's really surprising for somebody that seems so stuck on it. Maybe the earlier stuff is maybe he's a little tighter about that stuff, but I remember like counting the blinds on a window and being like, he didn't keep the same number,
That's a bizarre thing to obsess about. You could drive yourself crazy with that.
Yeah.
Counting the blinds. Because you put the name tag in the right place, but leave the blinds alone.
Yeah, exactly. Also, in the pencils, there's a 2-page spread looking down on the whole city that he took out.
Huh.
Okay. Once we flip through the book, then we'll look at some of the scans that we've got too. So we'll take a look at that.
And that's Athena showing up, who's one of the major political players in Olympus, and her sidekick Nike, which I thought was a cool name.
And on this page, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Oh no, Athena's design also fairly reminiscent of animation, that would have been popular at the time. The super angularity to it, and also Dunan's chin is a very animation, heavy design in my estimation. Seems like she seems like she could be a villain in a Bubblegum Crisis OVA or
certainly. And yeah, that elevator scene on the right there looks so right out of animation, the way he does these screen tone lights going over.
Yeah, I had tagged that as something I really liked. Two things I liked is like going back to really solid threading in his storytelling, like having these smoke puffs and the pipe kind of keeping you in no matter what's going on. There's the pipe, and then you get into the elevator, and I love that lighting effect of the elevator moving up and creating that shadow on her face.
Yeah, and there's a great scene where she punctuates what she's saying by kind of tapping her pipe on an ashtray.
Right here.
Yeah, that was a trick that I got a lot from the Blade of the Mortal artist. Is he would give everybody, they'd have these long conversations where they didn't move, and he would give everybody like they'd be eating or they'd have a pipe that they were doing, and it would just give you a visual something to look at that wasn't different shots of characters' faces.
Yeah, and it's very expressive throughout here. So I tagged that page for that, and the elevator there.
It's funny how underrated that is in comics, but that's like a stage trick in terms of if you're especially like a bit player, and you have a long bit of dialogue, maybe your only bit of dialogue to deliver, having something to fidget with or having something you can manipulate is like a like a standard like direction fix to
Good point.
But yeah, it's interesting, like the very limited use of that in comics. I'm making notes here of things I'm planning on stealing.
Okay. On this page, this is one you guys were talking about, the good relettering job. Brennan, do you know where the tags were originally in Japanese, I'm assuming?
That one actually, I think it might say the same thing in Japanese.
Knowledge Society.
Yeah, because there's a couple things. Like I noticed in the very beginning, there's a spice rack binder, and actually found the Japanese page, and it says the same spice in the same handwriting.
Well, what I'm interested in here is they replaced this with they replaced the Japanese, and in the scan I'll come up. So this is one of the couple things I scanned in the book.
Okay, so I'm wrong. So was that actually just Japanese on there?
Well, they had.
I don't know. I
was
asking.
No, they probably had to flip it so it's still red when it was left to right.
Oh yeah.
No, it's in English here, but
right.
The reason I asked is because whoever lettered it cut out the screen tone and everything, and then you can tell they tried to hand stipple screen tone back in.
Right.
But it's really bad.
Oh, it's tough to do.
Yeah. But I guess it would just it would just be the flipping it. You'd have to not flip the words.
Right. You'd have to manually manipulate that, and that's a tough, almost impossible to make a manual screen tone touch up like that. You really have to just swap out the whole section if you want it to be perfect.
Yeah, you guys will see when we go up close. It was really like, oh, come on, just leave it white, man. It'll look more like a badge. So that one was funny. I don't know if there's scenes in here that you all.
Well, they play into Hitomi's helmet. There has got like it's got like a 7-headed snake or something. So Olympus in general, and even like just Appleseed in general, even outside of Olympus, has this whole Greek kind of theme to everything. Even Briar Rose, his last name is Hitocrates, and just everything that he pulls from his science fiction is Greek. And they have like the council that all dresses in robes and things. It's kind of a cool like anchoring point for the science fiction.
Now that you've pointed this out, though, like this is straight out of one of your books. When I like just zoom in on just that, like the little square.
Oh yeah, no, the embarrassing level of Mobius and Shirow that runs through everything I draw is pretty apparent when you look at their stuff.
Even the lettering style on here to me is like, oh yeah, as soon as he points that out.
Do you feel like your writing on Prophet was influenced in terms of the world building? And
probably a little. I think with Prophet I was trying a little bit. I always regarded Prophet as a failed version of Nausicaa, because Nausicaa is like it's one of the I have this whole argument about Nausicaa versus Akira, because I actually think Akira as a story kind of weakens as the plot goes on, and Nausicaa strengthens as it goes on. Mm-hmm. So the beginning, I think the first volume of Akira, you have a really clear idea of what he's doing, and by the end of it, it's just like it feels like he got very caught up in the weeds of it, where Nausicaa at the end of it, you have an even clearer idea of the character and the motivations in the world than ever before. But that's probably a longer conversation.
No, yeah. It's just, it seems like there's so little science fiction in a true sense in the like mainstream comics, in the sense of having a speculative topic that is actually adhered to or followed through.
Yeah, well, I definitely think a lot of the biggest science fiction authors, like guys like Robert Heinlein, were obsessed with the idea of like, I feel like for readers, a lot of their work just feels like they came up with all these fun ideas, but they were obsessed with this idea of trying to show where humanity was going. And I feel like Shirow was definitely coming from that same place, where even though it's just like, here's a wacky spider robot, I feel like reading interviews with him and when he talks about this stuff, it just feels like he was so deadly serious about the science of everything that I wonder if he was even as much a fan of science fiction as he was just like a fan of like science.
Science, right?
Yeah, and because I haven't read enough of this to get into it. To me, focusing on this seems like the police force aspect of it, like, is what I got out of it so far. Ghost in the Shell seems much more like speculative about AI and things like that. So I'm curious to see this one. It sounds like it's more about genetics.
Yeah, at its core, I feel like Appleseed is basically like, it's kind of a cynical view of what it would take to make a perfect society. And I think it's cynical because he's like, well, you'd have to redesign humans so they're less horrible.
Yeah, less human.
Yeah. And then he's like, and what are the problems that would be inherent in that? And I think that oftentimes is when he gets caught up in all the SWAT stuff, because you know, because the actual problems might be more boring sitting around and talking.
Yeah, the political stuff, right? Like the administrative nature of keeping a perfect society together.
Yeah.
That's an interesting idea.
You get into fairly extreme examples of that in later volumes. Giant spider robots trying to explode things while people argue in a darkened room in a circle.
I look forward to that. Speaking of the
Yeah.
robots, come on, those are
Man.
so cool.
Yeah, that is not, that is just, that panel is showboating.
But it also looks like I could kind of figure out what all the mechanisms are supposed to do. It's not just cool robot shit. It's like, here's a piston and it comes down to this thing that's allowing the arm to turn. This is where the pump is at. Yeah.
That really looks to me like somebody who has disassembled and reassembled their older brother's motorcycle and has read a ton about existing robot technology.
Have you guys read the art book he did, Entron Depot, his first art book?
I got flipped through it one time. I did not have the money for it, but man.
Well, my point is just basically the notes in it are him chastising himself for getting things wrong. So there's like a picture where it's like a bunch of military guys in camouflage, and he's like, of course, if I wasn't such a hack, you wouldn't be able to see them because they would be in full camouflage and they would be almost invisible. And it's just like, it's like he's so obsessed with kind of wanting to explain the reality of things and making it work. And yeah, it feels almost apologetic sometimes, but I really like it.
Well,
and the reader's just like, that looks tight.
Yeah, totally. That page on the left is interesting in the English version because I think, what does your version say? The little sign on the
coffee house, and then coffee house Onimo, not
and
animal,
there's a
but Onimo.
smaller sign next to it. I think.
Cerebus rules.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
So that is just for the English version. And it changes several times, I think, in different editions, but I really like the idea that the production team on it was big Cerebus fans.
I had not even noticed that, and like I should have noticed. Did you notice that, Sean?
I did not. I'll have to fax it to Dave.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I should have totally noticed that. What terrible Dave Sin collaborators we are. This right here is another super Brandon Graham moment to me. Just a little coffee house Onomo written on here. To me, that looks like your lettering. Your lettering style must have been influenced a little bit by this.
So the way that I learned to letter was actually the same letter as this Orzowski. He lettered Dirty Pair, the Adam Warren series, I think, early on. And I would actually I would try to double up the size of the Adam Warren Dirty Pair lettering. And and years later I would actually go out to dinner with Adam Warren at conventions, and I've asked him so much about Shirow, he probably never wants to talk about Shirow again. But I made him at one point go through the first issue of Appleseed he drew page by page and answer every question I had.
It was very considerate of him to do that. Now that you pointed out Cerebus, I see Cerebus in this bush right here.
Oh, weird.
Yeah,
I know that's not the intention, but
yeah, I wonder how much Shirow was aware, because I know there's a big Frank. If you get into like the Battle Angel Alita, there's a big Frank Miller influence in that. So it'd be interesting and finding out more what Japanese artists in the 80s were actually looking at American comics wise.
Yeah, and what the original translation of that was like. Was that in there?
I have that page here, but it's so tiny. I might have to zoom in on a big scan.
Would you be able to read it?
Maybe not. That is a good point,
but you could read the Japanese if you saw.
Well, he wrote everything in English. I think all of the graffiti is originally in English.
Oh, really? Okay.
In Japanese, yeah, because they live in. I mean, it's like. Ex-America.
LA.
Yeah, I think the actual city they're in now is supposed to be, in the Caribbean, maybe, or something like that. It's on an island somewhere.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's a mostly American society.
I love the interior shots in the first chapter too, when they're inside and they're at home and they're comfortable. To me, those are some of my favorite shots in the book. Just the compositions and the cities out the windows.
Yeah, and there's a weird lines of dialogue in that because they're just talking about how she smuggled wine from someplace, and then there's a weird line. I don't have the actual page of it here, but there's some line where she just kind of casually mentions about how the resources from a community should go to victims and not
Right.
and not assailants.
Perpetrators.
Not
Right.
perpetrators, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that's kind of where a lot of the like my kind of teenager ideas about this kind of feeling like American right-wing stuff came from.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, Carson and I have talked about being sort of personally. I don't know if we've talked about this on camera, but being apolitical in a sense that you don't necessarily have a tribe that you're like looking for the flags of the tribe. But it's interesting when he hits those notes that to us say right wing, to just remember that the context is so different that it's like, he's not signaling a whole other set of hidden intentions or something from that. I think you're right that there's like a deterministic like competency streak.
Yeah, and something that I realized, I lived in Canada for a decade, and something that occurred to me when I was up there is in America we have these very clear set ideas of what different political ideologies, but even if you're in another country, it gets all mixed up. They don't have conservative and liberal in the way that we do.
Right.
So it's I don't have enough information to know where Shirow sat politically, but he definitely liked competency. And was against the idea, and the whole city in general seems like they talk about how there's no unemployment there and no homelessness, and it's basically because they've gotten rid of normal people.
Right.
But competency is almost seen as like you hear like guys like Jordan Peterson talk about competency a lot, and that gets him called a Nazi.
Sure.
A lot. Like people do look at that as a negative a lot these days, I think, which is, I mean, if you take it to the point where you have a military run city, yeah, it's a little crazy, but it's a weird thing to have like a current backlash against almost, I think. Like it's an odd thing to shit on.
Well, yeah.
It's interesting that in the context of the story, they're dangerous because of their competency. I mean, Hitomi's entire job and existence is basically to take these wild people and you put them to some use, like constrain their competency in the proper channels.
Yeah, very much so. And it is interesting because I think that Athena is kind of working more from the other side, where she doesn't trust these people, and she's like, we'll get to it later, but she actually starts drugging their food just to prove how dangerous they are.
I thought the drug was enhancing them somehow. I thought it was they were testing out an enhancement. They were diminishing them.
Yeah, they're basically like, look at how crazy these people are when we drug their food, which is and Athena is such a despicable character in it, because she not only drugs their food, but then later on when those people that have been drugged act like people whose food have been drugged, she publicly chastises them. Which I guess there's a lot that can be kind of ruled into this about kind of, it is hard not to overlay American politics on this stuff, because there is, like, kind of talking about the Peterson stuff, is I think that there is kind of a veneer of, if you're advocating for competency, then you're saying that people that are not in a situation to become that competent are kind of lesser and kind of fall behind. But it is, I oftentimes have these thoughts, and then I'm like, I'm glad that I draw comic books and am not making large political decisions for the masses.
Yeah, I'm not competent for that.
Right.
It's interesting though, because I've run into this a couple times. I've read some manga, but I've never been as deep into it. It's a new flavor for me that I'm really getting more excited about. And so in a couple of the videos now, we've run into where I noticed something from a very American standpoint, and then Sean or someone else will point out to me, oh, like that's kind of just a thing in the manga, and like people who are reading manga would understand these tropes more. So it is very interesting to me to have to start to always put that in my mind, like put aside my cultural understanding versus like what their kind of worldview will be in formulating these things. It's a very difficult task, but
yeah, because we're also dealing with Shirow's worldview of what Americans would act like in the future.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's triple lens there. So you're holding off on going to the page that I keep on thinking you're going to go to.
Yeah, well, there's a reason though, because I'm glad we stayed on this page, because if we're thinking about the same page, this help explains it to me a little bit more. She's messing around with this knife. On her, she's got a knife like strapped to her leg here, and then I don't know where it goes.
Oh, and she
This
mentions
is-
that she's like, don't worry, I'm not a cutter, which is a weird.
but this is what you're talking about, Sean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I first read this scene, I wrote a note. Where the hell did the knife come from? Like, I thought, did she have this thing keistered or what? Like, where's this at? So I'm glad now we spent so long like, talking while we were looking at this page. I'm like, oh, she has, but she takes it off and puts it in something.
She just put it back on, but when she got in the shower, she literally has a knife at her beck and call while she's in the shower. And really, who can blame her?
Yeah, and DNM is a crazy person, but it's it's that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you kind of thing. Like there's so many scenes of her. One of my favorite pages Shiro ever did is just a scene of her making a fake shape of her in bed and then hiding behind a couch and falling asleep. And it's just this constant, like they're in this utopia society and she's just constantly acts like she's in a military zone.
I had flagged this drunken Hitomi shower scene for a couple reasons. One is that this is the post Shiro future right here that we get a little hint at, the post narrative Shiro future once he abandons like making narrative comics. And I don't think he ever like officially retired or anything. It seems like mostly he went into pinups and basically teaching himself how to digitally paint in an insane fashion while working out fun porno comics. And it's interesting to me because you see the little seeds of that here, lovingly rendered as always. And then, but also that there's a narrative justification for the whole thing and plot rationale in that I think this is the scene where she figures out that Hitomi is partially synthetic in some sense, right? She's like surprised by how light she is.
Huh. Yeah, maybe it's just a clue to lead up to it. It's a weird scene because I don't know. I can't argue for it advancing the plot and all. And it's also weird because I feel like in general, the first Appleseed book almost feels kind of asexual compared to his later work.
Right.
It's almost like, I don't know, there's a couple artists like that. Like Milo Manara, his early work is much less sexualized than his later work. And I wonder if it's almost like people getting their footing and then having the audience reaction being like, oh, I like the naked shower scene. And then being like, okay, more of that then.
Right. Or just gaining sort of confidence in what they want being as important as what they perceive a reader might want.
Yeah, and Guido Creepaw, who I keep mentioning that I want to get to his works like that too, where it gets way, way more erotic and pornographic as it goes. And I read an interview with him where he was like, I never really set out to make erotic comics. That just kind of wound up where
it's not totally, hopefully it's not totally off topic, but I got to go to dinner with Milo Manara years ago, and he told me a Kripak story that I thought was really interesting, where he was at a convention and he saw Kripak's like sitting alone and was like, why is no one speaking to him? I'm gonna go talk to the guy. And he went over and introduced himself, and I'm butchering everyone's name, of course, but Kripak's he was like, oh, I'm sitting over here because I didn't think anyone liked me in the younger comic scene. And Manara said, like, no, we just have too much respect for you. We just don't want to, hand you a beer. And he was like, everybody likes you too much is the problem. And that was kind of nice to hear that he got told that at one point.
Yeah, that would be a nice thing. We'll maybe have to have you back for that episode then for some stories there.
I haven't read enough of his. I actually have a commission of one of his characters coming up, but I need to kind of read up on his work because I've read The Man from Harlem, I think, but I haven't read a lot of his kind of more known work. But it would be a good chance to get into it.
But in this conversation about the erotic elements is interesting because we're talking about guys who ramp it up. You've ramped it down in your career.
Yeah, I always joke that I'm trying to do a reverse Manara.
Okay.
Although I think I'm ramping it back up because I feel like comics is getting so timid in a way on the stands that it almost feels like people that are willing to be like, let's throw caution to the wind and just draw like the next series I'm doing actually has a prostitute as one of the main characters just so I can talk about sexuality in the work. But yeah, my Rain Like Hammer series just feels like It just didn't seem super appropriate for me to be doing this like big emotional thing and have tits on every page.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
It is interesting that it sort of turns off some huge segment or whatever percentage it is of the audience to have these sort of things that they perceive as, you know, flags or whatever. But it's funny that, like, in of course daily life, you see nudity all the time because you go to the bathroom and you take a shower and, you know, we still have all these interesting barriers. You missed another fantastic car. This is just like Shiro Car City there. So yeah, I mean, that one at rest right there with the notice tires turned away from the curb.
Oh yeah. Exactly. In book 2, I think it is, he actually has a Sid Mead car that he actually writes S Mead on. Oh yeah, that page you're on now is fantastic. The they're kind of going, and his costume designs are so impressive too. Like, I like sometimes the characters later on books they get even more severe, but sometimes the characters are just dressed like idiots.
Do they seem Greek to you? Like sort of like Greek combined with the like club setting, early '80s American?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. Oh, something that I missed about the shower scene that I meant to bring up is that when Dyunan has the knife to Hitomi, the dialogue there is about how they don't commit. She's like, we don't commit seppuku anymore. And I guess
they
that
call
means
it
that
Harry Carey.
Harry Carey, yeah. But I guess that means that Hitomi is Japanese.
Japanese, yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
I've forgotten her boyfriend's name, but I think they might be both Japanese.
Oh, Yoshi.
Yoshi, right?
Yeah, very Japanese. And Chiffon shows up in that scene. Who, interestingly, in the pencils, he actually always draws her like screen tone. Like he shades her in the pencils always.
Huh. Okay. So he needs to indicate that to himself that she has darker skin.
Do you think all those exterior shots with all the identical trees are a visual limitation or shortcut, or you think this is telling us something about how they planted these and when, and that they're all, you know?
Oh yeah, I mean, it does look very controlled, which definitely fits with the whole Olympus.
These two, Sean, is what you're talking about.
Yeah, and then look at the
cut and paste in a way.
The big growth of them in the back are all identically. I don't know if you guys know that all of the palm trees in LA, several prominent roads are all dying simultaneously because they all have a finite lifespan that's exactly the same.
Oh,
and so some drives were all planted all at the same time, and they're all literally dying at the same time.
That's going to be depressing, or is already depressing.
It's a little blown out right now, Carson. Is there something?
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. The camcorder is going to look good, but this webcam looks.
Oh, I forgot.
We're switching over.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
But for you guys' sake, if there's anything you want to talk about. Oh, Sean, this is the page where I saw very clearly the curly Q pattern that you were talking about that referenced an emotional state.
Right.
Oh, right.
So that was like, we had been talking about that, 2 weeks ago, and I saw it like, oh, there it is. And Brandon, you're saying this is more common in the girls, like romance?
I think so, especially in the 80s. And that scene you're on now is possibly one of my favorite scenes in comics. It's just like they go to this restaurant that's so high in the sky that if you reach out your hand, you can catch St. Elmo's fire in it, which is interesting because also comes up in Tintin when they start climbing up into mountains. And I've never encountered anyone talking about St. Elmo's fire anywhere but Appleseed and Tintin.
And here's another, this feels very, that like overdone dot pattern, like huge big dots spread apart.
Yeah.
That seem to have an emotive response. I really love the panel border warping. This has something to do with the atmosphere, the height they're at, I think.
Oh yeah. Oh, and there's that trick there. I did that comics lovers book that I think we talked about before.
Yeah.
Where I would basically break down kind of what I liked about comics. And there's this scene in this where they order food without actually saying anything, maybe on the previous page. I think one back.
Right. This is the ice cream one. I know that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the ice cream one. It's the same trick where basically the ice cream one is even more complicated. But the ordering food one is this very simple idea where they're still carrying on their conversation about basically what a weird city Olympus is. And the waitress walks up to them and basically visually they're ordering food, but they never say what they're going to order, and then their conversation doesn't really break, and the food shows up, and it's like you get all the visual cues, but it doesn't have the boring thing of like, hey, I want to have this, because it's not important at all to the story. Also, Chiffon has this great line here where she talks about how they're humans are all animals that build their own cages. And I worked on an episode of Adventure Time, and I snuck that line in there as just like a super nerdy Shiro thing, and I got away with it.
That's actually for so long, that line.
That's something I've been thinking about for the last year and a half now, I think, because I've had to start teaching graphic design and 2D design with my new position. Those weren't classes I taught before. And I've been thinking over and over and over about the fact of design principles, and that these always seem to lead to objects, and maybe that's what he's getting at a bit. These lead to objects and environments and just ways of interacting with the world that, as we progress further and further in society, just wind up more and more and more distressing to us. So you think the principles of design are to give us something pleasing in the end, but really we wound up designing an entire environment that's anxiety inducing. And that's something I've been pondering over and over and over lately. Like boxes and harsh lines are distressing to us, but that's our tendency, is to design houses that way. And like over inundation of information and visuals and stuff is distressing, but that's how we've designed our society.
Interesting. I feel like there's two sides of that. It's either that we don't know what we're doing, so we keep doing these things, not understanding the impact on our actual lives, or the idea that we need to create stresses even in our life. Even in this, they talk about how there's a council that shows up later that talks about how humanity in 3 generations is going to stop being able to produce more children because the stresses are wrong. And so I wonder if it's part of our subconscious creating stresses. Even if we have a comfortable life, we need to have these like baseline hunter-gatherer stresses so we function like humans.
Right.
Yeah, I've not come up with any answer at all to the question, but tagging that line there brought that back to me. Something that I've been thinking, and kind of left it alone for last month. So thanks a lot for bringing back that that question to my mind. This is your ice cream scene that you like so much.
Yeah, that thing is amazing.
Can you describe what it is that?
Right. So Diana and Briar Rose also, excuse me, just as my water is gone. Dionan's wearing a shirt that says the French word for stranger on it too, or for foreigner. At stranger or something. I'm not pronouncing anything right, but her and Briar Rose are sitting by the tree having this conversation about how weird the city is, and the conversation never breaks. But that middle panel on the right page is an ice cream truck. You just see an ice cream truck. They're not in the panel at all. And then on the bottom right panel, so on the bottom left panel, she's still sitting down in the grass. But on the bottom right panel, without the conversation breaking at all, they're just walking down the street holding ice cream.
So there's like some magic moment here where they've walked over there and bought the ice cream.
Yeah, basically to have it work in continuity, they would have to get the ice cream between those 2 sentences incredibly quickly. But I think it's just this great visual reference that just shows you like, this is where they got ice cream from. Don't worry about it. Now they have ice cream.
Right. Even the shot of the ice cream, look at the perspective of that is down on the ground where they are. So that's their point of view shot from the middle. And then you see her gazing in the next panel. So he's once having established her view of it, he tells you, yeah, that's her view. And then they're there. They've got it.
And she's looking at it, wanting it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is interesting because it deals with the problem of how you have to compress time in comics.
Yeah.
Like the conversation may be pretty short, the amount of words that they're saying, but the amount of actions you want to get through don't map onto that, right? If you were to sit there with a stopwatch and time it out, and to let go of that, like I think a lot of people would try and time it out, like, okay, if I say these words, it's 5 seconds worth of action. It's interesting to let go of that. And I would have never probably noticed that in this page if you hadn't pointed it out.
Well, it's the least important thing to them too.
Yeah, and that's the stuff that leads me to calling this guy a genius, is I'm like, I don't know how that thought process works to show time in such a way that does not work like how we experience it.
Well, I think it is how it might be how we experience it. It's just not how we record it.
Oh, that's a
Yeah.
good point.
And I think for her, the important thing is the context of the conversation, and also they did get it, but it's not, their interaction or whatever is like the least of it.
Yeah, you're getting both important things. You're getting the important conversation, and you're getting the important kind of maybe memory of what was happening at that time. But those two things wouldn't necessarily sync up well, and so you just throw that to the wind and you sync it up however. And then, like, the human mind is so good at taking a bunch of different information and just creating the sense of stability out of it anyway. So
certainly,
screw it, just go with it.
Can we just take a second to appreciate the masonry on display there? Oh man.
Oh yeah,
that's that same emotional pattern too.
Yeah, it is. But also the part that he leaves blank above Briar Rose's head there is really fascinating because it kind of pops the characters out.
And I think I have that tagged in a couple pages too, where he will use that blankness for an emotional read. Yeah, totally. A couple pages later, with so many backgrounds all over the place. And then when he drops her off, I think I skipped the page there, but he drops her off and then walks off on his own, and he's alone now and thinking about her, and that total interiority of that space. And then also the interiority of he doesn't really have contour lines down here, which is one of my favorite manga tricks. You just go to like an outline, all of a sudden there's no contour, and you just fill it in with those dots. So he becomes even more like hermetically like a lump there. We're talking about his training as an artist. To me, that's very like Rodin. He'll make these really closed off sculptural forms, and then against all of the white there, it's just such an interior headspace.
Something interesting about Briar Rose that I should bring up before I forget is that giant circle in the middle of his face that looks like his central eye is actually his nose.
Oh, okay.
Weird.
Yeah.
Oh, you're creeping me out.
Yeah, it explains all this weird stuff in some of the back matter. But on the previous page of that, there's a really fascinating use of the action lines as emotional thing, where Briar Rose is just like, it's like he's not moving at all, but he like sees someone to his right and has this kind of like action line emotion.
Or it's almost like he's turning, maybe.
Yeah, maybe
it's like staying in place, so you haven't moved, but you've moved rotationally, because that would be hard to show in a comic.
Or just like destabilized.
It almost gives the effect of like a camera spinning around a character, kind of.
Yeah, like in the Matrix.
Right, exactly.
That kind of effect, yeah.
And then that page on the right is such a girls' comic layout.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah, like that skinny panel that just has this like light burst with words in it.
And this little,
Shitaru loves me or whatever.
Yeah, dreaming about her with the flowers. So you talk about the asexuality of this. I haven't read the other ones, but do they ever go into like the sexual relationship between a human and a robot?
I have no idea. There's actually there's a French comic artist named Trinket who did this beautiful Appleseed fan art, and it just, the only text on it says, "Do Unit and Briar Rose have sex? Because they sleep in the same bed sometimes, but their like sexual relationship is." She accuses him of being gay a lot. It's like it's very vague for something where he gets into such the intricacies of things that kind of don't matter. That is the actual main two characters' relationship is unclear.
But she seems fairly. I mean, I don't want. She's a fictional character. She seems fairly damaged to me, and it seems like she's had some fairly. They've both had some fairly severe. I mean, I don't know if this is reading too much into it, but I mean, I don't know if it would be too much to say that he could be an embodiment of the trope of the safe guy, in the sense if he doesn't have any equipment or ability.
He does have genitals. Shirow makes a point of leaving that in.
Okay, well, forget it.
Not in the story.
Forget it. Clearly, I'm wrong.
He's also a weird figure because he's friends of her father's that trained her, and then they had kind of a military relationship. So it might just be that they have a very familial but not normal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's very Greek too, right? Like the platonic mentorship.
Yeah, I've never understood the use of platonic, because my understanding is that Plato was one of the guys that would be sleeping with his young male students. So it's like when someone's like, we have a platonic friendship, it's just like, I think that guy boned a lot. I don't know.
Right.
No, the
He was
that
all about
comes,
it. The cave
that comes
full
from
of sex. It was
Sorry, what were you
no,
saying?
that comes from the dialogue. I forget which one. I think it's the Credio. Anyways, they're all. It's a Platonic dialogue, a very famous one, maybe the Phaedra, where they've had a night out drinking, and they're all too drunk to drink again, and so there's a bunch of guys sitting around, and they decide to each give their opinion on what love is. And there's a character, Cephalus, I believe, who's a younger guy, and he's sitting around next to Socrates, and he obviously has a crush on Socrates. And Socrates goes on and on about how he loves him, but you know, he doesn't have any sexual feelings for him and stuff. And he describes that type of relationship. So it's coming from, it's a really funny dialogue too, because the kid is always sitting there like kind of horny for Socrates, and Socrates is like, yeah, I'm not really feeling it, kid, you know, like you're a good kid.
I'm just imagining the Bill and Ted version of Socrates,
Yeah,
which
so
I think we're all pretty attracted to.
yeah. Socrates
Yeah.
is all
So
about
great.
the sex in the
Yeah.
Platonic cave. Plato's cave.
I'm glad that I asked too, because you know I made it through 6 months of high school, so any information that I gain past that has to be in conversations about comic books usually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was I had a second degree in that, so I have read a bunch of that garbage.
Oh, nice.
But Plato's actually really readable, and that's a good dialogue. It's quite he's very funny. Like it's a story. His philosophy is always a story, and it's very funny. So I always found that one especially funny because of the way this kid keeps coming at Socrates. So I think that's where it came from. But that Greek mentorship sexual relationship, I mean, even you wouldn't call that Platonic because they fuck the boys, but
sure.
That's a very Greek thing. So given that you're saying there's a lot of Greek influence in there, that's an interesting fact that he was like her mentor, because that's a lot of those romances that they would have with the children was a mentorship relationship.
Okay.
Where they'd go find a pretty young boy and mentor them, but they'd also fuck them.
The version of that page you just passed that I have in the translated, they actually have they forgot to flip her kind of question mark on the middle on the right bottom. Is it that way in your version?
The question mark's flipped. The door looks backwards to me.
Well, because it's red from the front, maybe it's like glass.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. It looks like OIC. I don't know. It looks backwards.
Is that even English?
I don't know. It just looks like gibberish language.
Yeah, and this is when so Briarrose has found out that most of the population there are bioroids, and they had kind of an argument about it. And then he told Yunan, he said we're in a basically said that we're in like a hostile environment, and told her to go stay at Chiffon's place, which is like she's like the dark-skinned surfer from Bad Side.
Well, this is weird too. I just noticed this. They're like in this. They're at her place, right? Which is kind of this big compound, but then like Yunan's got like her own door name on it.
Oh, does it say Yunan on it?
Right here, like she's got a door with a name tag on it.
Oh, I mean, that's nice of them to put that up.
Yeah, but it's not her place, right? She's staying at someone else's house.
Yeah, but maybe that's the thing that I'm just immediately like, maybe Hitomi like took a 3D printer and was like, oh, here's your name tag for your door.
And he probably has notes on that, right?
It's a good visual cue to be like, this is Yunan's door.
Yeah. We're going in there now. But that's weird because it's at the end of the chapter. And then you get to the next chapter. And then they're going. Yeah. These are some good pages. They're rhythmic. He even has rhythmic noises in it. But this little piece, I always like that trick right there. It's like the 1, 2, and then a double note.
That it feels very American, doesn't it? Sounds
yeah,
like
it
a
does.
Daredevil, which I guess would be Miller doing
right
manga stuff.
Yeah, or Spawn.
Yeah,
McFarlane used that. I mean, later on, but he might have picked that up from here.
there's some weird stuff that happens with her boots and gloves, I think, over the next
In
couple
this
pages.
scene, in the next, okay. This last fight scene got confusing to me too. He goes into that confusing storytelling mode of like shit's just all over the place.
Yeah, which is kind of cool in a way where it almost like he has a level of competency that it makes me think that he's purposefully making scenes that would feel confusing to be in to read a little bit more like that.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely.
The lack of establishing shot thing, especially because, you know, when we go to their house, we'd see an establishing shot. There they are in the living room. They're both on the couch. You can see how they interact with each other and everything. But then you're right. As soon as we hit like a chaotic, the Hill Street Blues scene.
Yeah, there's a weird thing. Junon wakes up when she's first kind of woken up. She gets up and for some reason puts her boots and gloves on before she puts her pants on, which just feels very like like I could see her hearing a noise and throwing on shoes or something. But yeah, she just is sitting alone and decides it's time to put on her boot with a knife on it and her pair of gloves and wander around.
This right here.
Oh,
this is someone else. That's Chiffon.
That's Chiffon, yeah.
Yeah, there's the boots.
Yeah. And then the next scene when the bunch of the drugged people that were staying at Hitomi's place all go out, she's just wearing one glove for some reason.
Right here.
And I wonder if it's so the first panel she shows up, you just see her ungloved hand. And I wonder if this was me, I would get in this kind of situation where I drew her putting her gloves on, and then I show her without her glove, and then rather than redrawing it, I would be like, she's got one glove on now.
Well, yeah, she's got both gloves on here.
Yeah, and then one disappears.
But that could be like that ice cream thing that you're talking about. Like you can just fill in. Maybe that's the interesting thing that he's doing that was initially so distressing to me, is he's taking that idea of filling in between the two panels and he's making you fill in. And I had to do this. I had to flip back and forth between pages. So he's relying on my ability to retain a minute detail like that over a couple of pages and then make an assumption about what's been going on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of trust in the reader. I don't think it's just bad storytelling. I think it's, in his case, because you're talking about him being so much into minutia, I think he's just speaking to, I was always told like storytell to the lowest common denominator, like tell the story to the stupidest person in the room. And I think he's just said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm a sophisticated guy. I can rely on my people closing the gaps 10 panels later. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that quite a bit.
More fantastic vehicle physics here with that wheel off the ground and the compression of the tire out, the flare out from the top, or from the top to the bottom.
Oh yeah, is that a robot foot or a wheel? I think it's something.
There's
like
a wheel here. I think that's a wheel. There is some of that stuff where I'm like, I don't know what you're drawing, dude. And I love this comedic break here. They're out in a fight. Help, thanks, I don't need any. No, call a hospital.
Oh yeah, and the guy's like, hospital ain't gonna come when you call.
Yeah.
He feels very like
an ambulance.
Like a guy, like a character from MASH or something.
Yeah, Doonesbury almost.
Uh-huh. And this is the part where they show that Briar Rose also is capable of bleeding and has organs.
Right.
Okay, so he's some kind of like synthetic. He's not robots all the way through. It's like,
no, he's been patched up.
Bio guts.
Yeah, he was a caught in an explosion, and they go into this a lot later, but he's like the rarest kind of cyborg where his cybernetics and his brain are perfectly in sync, where normally it's very hard to find someone like that. And so he's able to they call it an octopus brain, where he can run an aircraft carrier off his mind.
Is he originally human brain then encased in cybernetics?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Like supportive cybernetics.
RoboCop.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and there's also the line here where he goes, like, Briar Rose says, like, they're getting away. They're too tough for these inexperienced cops to handle. So it's like, it's back to that competency. Like they're just like, oh, the police in this utopian society cannot deal with, like, I don't know if they've even dealt with the police in this society yet. They just assume incompetence.
Just some badass drawings here.
Yeah, just extraordinary.
Oh yeah, they break into the director's office and demand to know where the supercomputer that runs the city is.
So these are rebels, I'm assuming.
Yeah, these are
Ones who've been
the drugged ex-military people.
right, dissidents, been riled up with their Cheerios.
Yeah, see, I thought the drugs were supposed to get them riled up, but you suggested that they were trying to dampen her down with the drugs.
Oh, I think they're just aggravating them. They're basically Hitomi, or Athena wants to show what unstable people Hitomi's bringing into the city,
right?
By drugging them and getting them to act badly.
Gotcha. More just cool. The Akira tech.
Yeah, I love the guts of that computer right there.
Yeah, and they show it over and over.
Have you guys read much into like the like I've read a little, there's a great interview with, I feel like it's Urasawa talking about Otomo, and they basically talk about how there was a kind of false realism before Otomo showed up in Japan, and then when he showed up, it was like he was like kind of a genre unto himself, like no one else was doing what he did. And how guys like Osamu Tezuka were really cynical of him, where they're like, there's a quote where he said something like, you know, Akira's pretty good, but we'll see, you know, what he's doing in another 10 years. Like this, like very like cynical view of someone doing the really amazing piece of work.
Well, that's kind of like some of the stuff Dave has in Strange Death of Alex Raymond, where Milt Caniff is like, you know, Raymond, he's the real fashion plate stuff, you know, and you get those like compliments that are underhanded a little bit. Yeah, it's really good. But there's that competitiveness over someone being able to actualize a more intense vision of reality.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's jealousy or it's just the philosophical outlook they have on like, you don't need to do all that, man. Like, why are you doing all that? Just tell the story.
Well, and Tezuka was right too, because I mean, Otomo wasn't drawing for more than, I mean, you know, his career might have lasted 17 or 18 years, but as far as the intensity of the Akira onward, I mean, it was only another like 7 or 8 years before he was basically done with comics. I mean,
yeah, that's not untrue.
Yeah, so if it's just a comment from the wizened old guy being like, hey kid, you can't keep that up, you're gonna fall apart.
Yeah, and something I've noticed that has certainly gotten me into trouble is speaking to other artists the way that you speak to yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like if you're like, okay, the book's pretty good, but I need to do another page and keep working. And then if you vocalize that about someone else's work, it can come off a little bit too harsh.
Me and Sean just got into this actually, and I wonder if because Sean asked me to look over the script that he's revising for a book that he's going to be doing. And me going through, you know, all the way through a graduate program in the fine arts and philosophy as well, I've basically been trained to just be a ruthless critic.
Sure.
And I felt like when I was critiquing Sean, I was like, man, he's gonna be like, we're not publishing Strange Death of Alex Raymond, like I'll never talk to you again. And he told me, he was like, well, you know, I went through art school too, and what you think I don't know how to take critique. So I wonder if there is like a subset of people that, and I don't, Brendan, did you go through any schooling or you just came out the gate and figured it out?
I mean, I had a really unique artistic training in that my brother is very, like he actually teaches printmaking, or he was teaching printmaking for a while, now he works at a gallery. And then my group of friends were all SVA students. It was guys like Farrell Dalrymple and Tom Herbig and James Jean and guys like that. So I was kind of hanging out with these guys that were having this intense schooling and then would like critique my work from that. So I kind of secondhand got it.
I just wonder if there's like sections of the industry where people just got good enough and got into the industry without that rigorous like sit down and just get grilled for an hour. And then there's the people like them who have come through, like, there's nothing you could say to them to offend them type of.
Yeah, there's different sections. It's always funny when you talk to people. I remember hearing a story about Darwin Cook where somebody was drawing, someone was drawing a page or something, or working with him or something. And at one point he showed up and just put an X through their finished panel. And he was like, it's wrong, do it again. And there's a lot of stories about him being incredibly harsh, but I think that is also just a type of, like, there's a type of artist, because I used to be this guy Moritat's assistant, and there was kind of that attitude was very harsh sometimes when you're in just like a group of guys that are all trying to outdo each other and just make a living. And I feel like, yeah, it can come off very bad if somebody is not used to that type of harsh environment and they come in and just like, I want to draw pictures, you know. So this is probably the middle point.
I felt a little bit more impervious going through art school because I had been at conventions and stuff from like age 12 or 13 showing my work to artists.
Oh, that's good.
And editors and stuff. Or like, I remember being 13 and showing my stuff to Jim Lee, and 15 and trying to show my stuff to Neil Adams. And he was like, I'm not even going to look at it. You're too young for your work to be good. Like, if I look at it and I don't like it, I'm going to rip your art in half. And I was like, well, okay, you're just a freak. I guess I'm just going to walk away. You know, not that I'm scared of you. I just don't care to hear your opinion anymore.
Yeah,
it's I felt like it's such a harsh environment at the conventions that anything anyone said in grad school wasn't really gonna bug me.
Yeah, I think you're very right, and something like that really informed. There's people that I resent to this day because they were rude to me when I was 15, and I know, like, my saner part of me is like, I'm sure I was obnoxious 15-year-old walking up to people and wanting portfolio reviews all the time. But it's made it that when I'm at conventions and people show me their work, it's like I do not think that's an environment to say anything harsh to someone. I think it's much better just to look and you can ask people, do you want pointers on this? Do you want to talk about this? And then you can get into the needles of it. But I feel like there's a certain level of it that makes me think that people are just kind of just letting their egos run rampant when the child comes up to them and they shit on their work. Yeah. It's like, it doesn't help anyone.
Well, there's a status thing in comics that doesn't necessarily exist in other environments too, where people seem to be hyper aware of the sort of lowly status of comics for a long period of time, and sort of maybe perception of elevated status, and also the perception of themselves as having dug themselves to the top of this, you know.
Yeah, it's very silly. And I've had the exact same work shown to somebody as photocopies and had them complain about them, and then literally had the same people come back to me when a work is in print and tell me how much they liked it. And it's like, you know, minor things like the perception of status just make people act like crazy people.
Right.
Well, Dave, I did tell Dave that story, and he had a story. I won't tell it here because we're getting way off topic, but he said, do you know why Neil did that? And I said, no. And then he basically told me a story of how that had been done to him as a young man, and that's what spurred him on to greatness. And so he's just been repeating. So it's not this status thing. It's just like, this is how he got trained up, and that's how he's, you know. So I don't know. It's interesting, but
yeah,
it's weird. There's competitiveness or the harshness of critique. Yeah. I just wonder which environment is more brutal.
Yeah, and at what point it's actually helpful too. Like, it's weird. It's hard for me not to be like I wonder if Neil Adams was still in an environment where people were critiquing his stuff, if his modern day storytelling would be better. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to shit on Adams because I think he's fantastic, but I think that it's like somebody who's so clearly competent will put out a book like Blood, and you're just like, I feel that there's not he's not there's no pushback at all, you can tell.
Right.
Yeah, that happens with age too.
Sure, yeah. And I totally understand. I don't want my friends looking through my pages. Like, I have a thing now where people will be like, oh, I got a book of yours. You want me to hear opinions on it? And I'm like, if something's in print, I don't need to know anything that's wrong.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too late now.
Look, I'll send you a fax when it's about to be reprinted, and if it's typographical in nature, you can let me know.
Yeah, that is a good way. I do often think of as the kind of floppy comics as the first draft of something, and then you have the one chance to fix it for the print, for the trade, and then fix it for, yeah, I'd be interested in something like, because I mean, with Strange Death, you guys are basically reworking big sections of it from Glamour Puss, is that right?
No.
Yeah, Dave had redrawn the first 180. Basically, almost nothing was worked. Almost nothing made it from Glamour Puss to the second
Wow.
section. And so, if you read the books side by side, you'll see the development of his initial ideas, the development of the style he was hoping to do. It's a remarkable thing. He synthesized all of those elements into the final book. But yeah, it's I would say that something like 7 or 8 pages that use artwork straight from Glamour Puss out of the 180 something pages that Dave drew by himself.
Man, that guy's working too hard.
Yeah, well, he worked his wrist off.
Yeah.
Literally.
It's fantastic art here on this on these pages here.
Yeah, we went way far afield, but that's okay. That's fun.
I was trying to find those in the Japanese version. I don't think that sound effect is nearly as overbearing as it is in the American one. I really like it in there.
I think I had a tendency to work a little heavier, Brandon, because you would have to touch up less if you made the sound effect larger than the original.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Then you've got less to fill in after the fact.
I tagged this page also because of the sound effect issue, and the print on it's not so great. It's a little filled in. By the way, the print quality of the book I have is pretty good overall, but it has filled in a little bit here. I don't know if you guys can see on the copies you have, but it's hatched at the top of the exclamation point, which makes the exclamation point look like a cutout. So like it's a cutout of the balloon, and you're seeing through the balloon to the background behind it. I really liked that made the exclamation even more like, I don't know, like punchy, like it's a hole punch through. So it's like, oh shit, this punch moment.
It's really subtle.
Yeah, and I think some of that is to do with just filling in on the print. So I didn't scan that one, but another example of lines filling in on a print kind of destroying artistic intent a little bit.
Oh, certainly, yeah. The bottom left panel reminded me of a technique that he uses a lot, where just the puff of smoke there is just to indicate movement. It's like this very static leg with a puff of smoke and then action lines, and it's just like the action lines and the puff of smoke are all the indication of movement you need, and the actual drawing shows none, which is really interesting trick.
Yeah, it's like the step down has puffed smoke out to the side, so it gets that like shoot.
It's like a Jackie Chan movie. Yeah. In Jackie Chan movies, they'd cover people in like chalk dust, so when they hit them, it comes out.
Yeah, exactly. Look at that sound effect.
Yeah, that's great.
And this is a lot. This has a lot of. It has fap in there. It has this trap rap.
You get the high contrast with the explosions. There's a few examples of that in this last scene here. Just great observational, imaginative drawing.
Yeah, that bird is great. I'm trying to find that in the Japanese one, because I do think that they just made these. Yeah, like Sean was saying, they just make these giant things to kind of cover up not having to redraw the intricate stuff.
Raka. I'm looking for skirt. That would be fap, skirt, and brut. We'd get everything. Yeah, there's a screen. Here's one of the things you're talking about where you're looking through the helmet, right?
Right. That's great.
Kind of that Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man in the Marvel movies.
Oh, I've never seen any of those. Did they do that?
Really? You've never seen any of those?
I have not. I have not seen a movie since 2011, I think.
You've missed nothing.
Well, the ones I was watching in 2011 were all made in the 40s and 50s. So
I like those. I just was watching. Tori's kid was watching Guardians of the Galaxy 2 yesterday. That opening sequence with Groot dancing is one of my favorite sequences in the movie of all time.
Yeah, what was I watching? I was watching. There's a Louis C.K. started doing these videos on film, and he was shitting on Marvel movies, and then he reined it in a bit, and he was like, "Except for that first Iron Man, that one's great." And I thought that was like, it's such a universally entertaining movie that even if you're complaining about the phenomenon of Marvel movies, you still have to be like, but I enjoyed that one.
And if you haven't, either of you, seen that opening sequence to Guardians of the Galaxy 2, where it's a continuous shot and Groot is dancing and there's a fight going on in the background, From
Oh,
a
right, it's a little, it's the baby version of Groot, right?
yeah, and he's dancing, and the stories. So that's a really, to me, a sophisticated piece and a hilarious piece of storytelling, Sean. That is just worth it, just to see that scene, and then turn the movie off if you want.
He's like
It's
an ent or something.
Yeah, he's very
yeah,
much
but
an ant.
he's like this big, so he's dancing to a song, and then you get this, and the camera's constantly spinning, and they're fighting in the background. It's really good.
An homage to the missing full reel continuous shot of I forgot the name of the movie. Second second Orson Welles movie, Magnificent Ambersons.
Oh, right.
The ballroom dancing continuous shot, 14-minute.
Yeah.
Chopped
Another
pieces. Yeah, there's
that
another
looks
one
like you're seeing the guy's face. Yeah, because here's the robot he's in.
Oh yeah. They do a lot of, and later on they almost do. I mean, could go back to film tricks? They lose the fronts of their robots, so you can just see their faces in the robots.
And Sean, when we look at Fist of the North Star, I don't know if you've noticed it yet, but he does that all the time with prison bars. He'll just take the prison bars out, like, because he'll have two people on the same side of different sides of a prison, and he wants to show their faces. This page I found totally baffling. I had no idea who was where on any of this. This gets back into that battle scene stuff where it's just close-ups and like a long shot, and I can't make enough of like who's in which robot suit.
Oh, yeah, and they will oftentimes, I think in the dialogue they'll be like the blue robot, which is not helpful. But that has that big establishing shot.
Yeah, it does, and I flagged that one too because really strong use of blacks in terms of anchoring. Not a super common thing with him, but the anchor, Dunan has the black on the right side of her face exiting the page, and that sets up a nice anchor in opposition to the black that's on the upper portion of both that same page and the next one.
And it's great because it's her same, like that's the exterior of her suit looking the other direction. It's such a cool trick. Also the cop
this is
really
her suit.
Right.
Yeah.
It's called see, I started to get confused by a lot of that because it's like, okay, I'm assuming I can see this face. Like it just didn't stick to me whose suit was what. And so when they start flipping like that, it became a bit confusing to me, like who is what robot in these. I think color would have helped, or more with the tone, some of them would have been like specific tones that really set them apart.
It makes it a little easier at the larger scale because the tones don't fill in quite as much. It's easier to distinguish because they do use different tones. He's got like a 10% on some of them and like a 20 or 30 on some and like a 40 on some of the other ones to sort of indicate some.
You get that.
Right. Something you do in webcomics a lot, which would be interesting and something like this, is they would actually color code the text from each different character. So someone would always speak in orange, and another character always speaks in blue.
Yeah, tone over them or something.
I wonder, it seems much harder because I hate it when, in like Sandman or something, they would be like, this character always speaks in cursive. And I feel like that's a little, I'm generally not a fan of that.
It's distancing in a pretty heavy manner.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there's ways to do it. I mean, I think Sim did some interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
And although I will say my big critique of reading Cerebus sometimes is when characters speak in accents. Sometimes I remember just kind of checking out of big panel 4 of thick British accent.
Yeah.
That's an interesting. The dialect thing is definitely either an acquired taste or some type of mental like shift that's required because you got to like pace it out audibly in your brain in order to process it in the same way.
Yeah, it's almost meant to be read out loud. I haven't read the book Train Spotting, but I've heard that there's whole chapters of that written like that.
Right.
Interesting. Super image right there.
Oh, yeah.
Stephen Platt, Rob Liefeld picture. Just noticed that because we're hanging on that page. This whole scene, you can definitely see. When did these books hit the States?
2 years after the initial publication. So this first book came out in '86.
Okay.
Immediately won some accolades, and Torrin Smith, who was the localizer and publisher or not the publisher, but the packager, acquired the rights right at the award show. I believe is when he first established contact. He happened to be in Japan at the right time, and 2 years later, they were published through Eclipse. And he's a very interesting guy, and did, you know, as much as anybody, you know, the yeoman's work of popularizing manga in the United States, and I think he's a overlooked figure at this point.
Yeah, very much so. And he died fairly young, and
Did
yeah, he had such fantastic taste in what he brought over. That's always my frustration in modern manga, is so much of what is brought over is not what I wish brought over. But Torrance Smith had a way of finding things that were like, you know, there's a very kind of European sense to a lot of the manga that he brought over too. So I wonder if he was trying to make it if that was just his overall taste, or if he was very much trying to find things that would click with the Americans.
Well, I think he was big into the science fiction community in the Bay Area, and I think that his ties to that and his interest in science fiction probably, you know, influenced a lot of that. I mean, he seemed to have he seemed to hit the sweet spot between explorative and like sellability, and, you know, had a knack for, like, for instance, like signing Appleseed before it was adapted into a OVA or whatever.
Sure.
And next thing you know, there's another product on the market that people are crazy about that, you know, is advertising their comic essentially.
Yeah. Also worth mentioning is there's the Anime Gunbuster, which is really good.
Right.
There's a character named Smith Torn in it, named after him.
He lived at the Gynak's house for many months. Yeah, it was apparently like such an abhorrent living situation that people would show up, women specifically would show up and see the house that all these men animators and Torrance Smith lived in, and like leave immediately, like totally sickened.
Probably most houses full of a bunch of dude artists.
Oh yeah, totally. Spiders and jars on the table. And all kinds
There's a really cool showing on the right page where the Gyugs that they're called landmates, her big robot, has got these kind of back antennas that she uses to look around the corner.
Yeah, I wanted to point that out because this is one of those things that we were talking about earlier. But before we get to that, just also how much I love the simplicity of this drawing. In the middle of all the details, this one feels like he just did it all in one swoop and then toned it a little bit.
Oh yeah, and that's her kind of memory of Briar Rose telling her what to do here in this scene.
Yeah, but this is interesting because this comes around and goes around that corner and should wrap around the corner this way, right? But then the drawing almost flips. It almost looks like someone's looking back. We were talking about that earlier, about most comic artists would take that filmic perspective where you don't rotate the camera 180 degrees. But for the directionality of the page, it works real good to lead you there. But I got confused when I was looking at it because it looks like it's going to turn to like her left, but then here it wraps around like it's turning to someone's right. And it took me a second to track that. Someone mentioned, I forget who said that earlier, but you said that's something common in him that he kind of will ignore. I think, Sean, you were talking about that filmic need to kind of stay on someone's right side. And another thing I really like about this that actually accentuated the confusion for me, but then also ties them together in an interesting way, is this line carries down between the two panels. So there's that visual link all the way through, and it almost makes it look like, okay, this is the left side of the wall, this is the left side of the wall, this is the right side of the wall, this is the right side of the wall. But then that's actually flipped, and he flips the tone on it to give you the cue. So I found that to be a tricky little piece there. It's interesting.
Yeah, everything, it seems like it's always darker on the side away from Tunan too.
Oh, interesting.
Just like on a tone. It's something I like a lot about that too, is when she's using the back kind of stock eye things, the face on the mecha that she's piloting goes black. Like you don't see its eyes disappear. So it's almost like an indication that it's no longer using those to see through.
There's the other high contrast explosion.
Yeah.
There.
I like when they do that. Something I noticed when we were looking at Berserk too, where he'd all of a sudden go out of that thinner line style, and it's like he grabbed a brush and they get those higher contrast images because they use so much tone that you don't get a lot of those really, like this kind of image. You don't see a lot of that. Man,
Yeah,
and these, go ahead.
Oh, are we at the scene yet where she kills Chiffon? Did we pass that?
I don't think so. Maybe. I don't know these books. This is a total, this page is like Akira all the way through to me, especially that face. And these guys right here, they look like the kids out of Akira to me.
Yeah, we missed Chiffon's
Where's that
execution there?
Here.
Yeah, because it's very brutal. Like she realizes that's her friend, and she's like just mid sentence, and then she shoots her, and there's that great bottom panel of just the shell from her gun in the foreground.
Yeah.
That's
and
just,
again, looking through the suits a little bit, or they open their suits. They open their suits. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the front of her suits they're all smashed off in the fights.
right.
It's a weird character thing, because it's essentially like we know that Dunan is intensely competent and kind of very harsh is her kind of character at this point. And I guess Briar Rose is almost like her conscience.
He's the soft, cuddly one.
Yeah.
Even though he's the hard external shell.
He's shaped like a rabbit. You know, he's got a friendly silhouette, even though he's large.
Well, and Briar, that's the Max too, right? The Max is the Briar Rose, the rabbit. The
yeah.
In Stampede's Max. That's interesting. I haven't put that together.
And I think that's now. You're at the scene where Athena is chastising one of the people whose food she drugged.
Yeah.
It's the best.
He's the worst.
And then they all start vomiting. Oh no, they're punching him.
Yeah.
Did the drugs do that? They should have worn off by now, at least on the average person. But yeah, this looks back to like super Akira. And then Briar Rose in the hospital. There's another one of those really big dot tones.
Oh yeah, and the great panels of like I often wonder with that scene. There's all the pinup girls on the wall. Is that something that Dunan put up because he was bedridden? Did she like bring in his like sexy cop calendar and rip it apart and put it on the wall?
Yeah, there is. I hadn't noticed that.
She's very kind and accommodating to the people that she loves and trusts, which is probably why she's willing to murder the ones that screw her over.
Yeah, and then there's the joke where she kisses him and then messes up her lipstick.
Is this the scene from the ice cream scene?
Yeah, that's a little sample panel there, straight from the ice cream.
So he liked that scene. Somebody liked that scene. And Brandon, you had tagged this and sent it to me. I had tagged it too.
Oh yeah, I just really liked that kind of the overlay panel of Hitomi on the motorcycle, and then that little wheel thing that's almost just like a beat of, or is it the wheel kind of stopping?
Like these two right here.
Yeah, it's almost like that left side panel seems it would be completely unnecessary. Like you don't need it. It's just there almost as like a flourish.
Yeah, that's the exact same reason I tagged it. And I like, again, the directionality of it. And that it just comes in. And Sean, this is the physics you're talking about, like the tire squishes down and everything. It's almost like he realized he had some extra room in the composition, and so just did this beautiful little thing with it.
I tagged the kids walking across the street there, the crosswalk. That is a panel that could not have been drawn by anybody else at any other time. It's just so many of his distinctive visual tropes all in the same location all at once, and I know it's just a very distinguished drawing.
What are the things you see in there? Since I'm not as familiar with his work as you two are, what are the
well, I mean, it's not that those are. I mean, there's no oiled girls wrestling each other in the background or anything. But I guess what I mean is he's applying his sensibilities to a non-action scene of cute kids doing something cute, just walking across the street with their cross guard and singing a song or whatever. I liked to see him lavish that much, time on an image of these, like it's a kind of the equivalent to me of the domestic scenes of them sitting around, where you just sort of see people living their lives in Futuropolis, and that's temporarily given equal importance to mechs fighting each other and stuff.
Right. Also, the crossing guard looks very specific. Like it's probably like a British SAS or something uniform.
Right.
Yeah, it's got like a Mickey Mouse glove with the 3 little tickies on the back.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think at some point I looked up. I think "Rich Man, Poor Man, Bigger Man, Cop" is an actual song.
Right.
Okay.
Or like a kid's chant or something.
Yeah, it is really cool. And there's later on, he does a couple in book 2. I think there's a nice scene where he shows kids playing cops and robbers that she's watching, and it's always interesting to kind of how he brings in showing children, because sometimes, I mean, certainly something that a lot of action American comics do is they kind of, children don't exist, or they're the hyper focus of it will be like Power Pack, where it's just all about kids, but just to see like kids casually in one panel seems kind of rare.
Right. Or they're the token of the distress, like, to be carried around by the big bad guy who's going to menace everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, or you throw them into this like about to get exploded on and then
Right.
have to save them or something. Yeah. And then